Hello, welcome everyone to our panel today, Nations Talk, Cities Act, or I should say Cities Act with a question mark. I want to first off thank our sponsors, PSIA and Sciences Po, Reed Hall, the Columbia Global Centers in Paris, as well as Columbia undergraduate programs in Paris. And with that, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists today, Mayor Sami Kanan of Geneva, Switzerland. Also, Mayor Francois Croteau from the representing Mayor Valérie Plante from Montreal, but he is also the mayor of Rosemont La Petite Patrie. And then Professor Lorenzo Kilgren Grandi, who is also chair of Urban Flag and scientific advisor to the International Association of Francophone Mayors, as well as a fellow faculty member at Sciences Po. And me, I'm Nilda Mesa. I'm here from New York, and through the wonders of technology, we're all here together. I also wanted to thank Lou Garcia, who will be assisting us today during this panel. As everyone knows, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic has hit cities particularly hard. I read a statistic that was something like over 90% of fatalities have come from cities worldwide. And cities have been really at the front lines of how to deal with the impacts that come from this pandemic, along with everything else that they usually have going on. So I'm delighted to welcome our panelists today, because I think we'll have a lively discussion about what are cities doing and what can they do, as well as how they are working together through various networks, or even just small groups with each other to try to get a handle on what's happening with the pandemic in their cities, as well as other things. So, and I was going to say, so I'm Nilda Mesa. I'm visiting faculty at PSIA, at the Paris School of International Affairs with Sciences Po. I'm also an adjunct professor and researcher with Columbia University with the School of International and Public Affairs. And I'm the former director of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability for New York City. So this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. How is it that cities cope with crises and unexpected events? And how do they maintain some kind of livability and hopefully more than survive, but thrive as well? So with that, let me tell you a bit about the format. We will have 5 minutes for each of our distinguished panelists to talk about what's going on in their cities and within their subject areas. Each panelist has been asked to formulate a question for the other panelists. And we will have a segment then where the panelists will be responding to each other's questions. And I suspect that will be a lively interchange. And then for the last half hour, we will also have time for questions from you, our audience. So to ask a question, you can write it in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And we will be taking those. We hope to be able to answer as many questions as possible. And apologies in advance for those that we're not able to answer, and please don't take it personally. And also, as you're putting in your question, if you could put in what city you're from, or your affiliation or something like that, that would be great. So with that, then let me kick this off with Mr. Mayor Kanan, and tell us what's happening in Geneva.
Yes, hello again, everybody. It's very nice to be with you today for this very interesting exchange indeed, because the pandemic as such is obviously keeping everybody very busy personally, professionally, politically, and so on socially. But the matter of how the cities in general react and handle this major crisis is a very crucial topic indeed. within the wider framework of the increasing role of cities at, local, national, and international level. So thank you very much for inviting me. And Geneva can be considered as one of the more privileged cities, for sure. We are in a rich country, Switzerland. We have resources, but let's be also honest, it has been a huge shock. We were for sure not prepared to such a major crisis. At least for Swiss standards, I would say it's the worst crisis in World War II. So it has been a very tough learning process, and very quickly for all levels. As you know, Switzerland is a federalistic country with the federal level, the cantonal level, which is a kind of state or a region, and the local level, municipalities. And in a normal sense, it works quite well. It's rather a slow system because there's a lot of negotiation and, taking into account the level of the cantons and so. But within this crisis, it had to be fast. So the federal government first started to have a kind of state of urgency, which is very, very extremely rare in Switzerland. Took over the power, but only for the first vehicle. So last spring, 1 year ago. And since last summer, it's again the usual political system, which makes things slow. But the cities are at the end of the whole story at the institutional level. So when the parliament took power again and said to the federal government, you cannot take decisions without, making consultation with crucial entities of the country. The parliament included like the federal employers association, trade unions, the cantons, and when it was an attempt from one of the member of parliaments to include also the cities within the area of entities which have to be consulted for any new decision, the majority of the parliament skipped the cities of the law. So we learned the decisions from the media, like any citizens, and we have obviously a high responsibility to implement them, and often with a very short notice. So I understand the short notice, far from that, but still, now we obviously learn to get the information slightly before media now, but only through informal channels. So this is one of the, Switzerland is a country which still does not recognize the cities as far as it should, in terms of, economic, social, cultural importance, and especially of entities which, I know I talk to convince people, but who are in touch with daily business of the population already in normal times, social issues, cultural issues, urban issues, diversity, and so on. But especially in this crisis, we were at the first level of the immediate needs. And one of the main impacts of this crisis are the increasing inequalities in many fields. It has made obvious things we more or less knew. Geneva, I said, is a rich city, but we have also our strong inequalities socially, economically, culturally. And somehow the system was managing it, and through the loss of jobs of many very precarious people who worked at the edge of society, more or less illegal, or even if legal, but with low salaries and unstable contracts, they became jobless, sometimes even homeless. And it's actually the city which took care of them. And in a very urgent way. We suddenly had thousands of people who had to get food, just food to survive in a rich city. The same, interestingly, for all the small businesses who suffered a lot. The cities have been very helpful, often much in a more pragmatic and immediate way than the upper levels. And also in another field, the digital divide. It's true that this crisis have put forward a massive role of IT, of virtual and other means. And it made clear that many people were not prepared to be so active on internet, video conferencing, homework, homeschooling. And again, it's a factor of inequality, because in a low-income family, you have computers, you have smartphones, but no computers. So when it's about doing homework and homeschooling with the kids, it's also a factor of inequalities. And these are, I would say, long-term, at least mid-term consequences of the crisis. So it's a fascinating learning process. But as a whole, I talk with other cities in Switzerland. We have been much more close to the people with practical solutions than the upper levels. The upper levels also did their job. But it was frustrating for us to not be taken into account in the consultation and discussion about how to act. So we had to adapt on all, I mean, we had to adapt towards the upper levels who made decisions and to adapt towards the population, which had immediate needs. Microphone, Professor.
Thank you. That was very interesting and complete. Mayor Coteau, what can you tell us about Montreal and your own town as well?
Thank you very much for this morning and for this invitation. I'm very honored to represent the mayor of Montreal, Valérie Plante, this morning, for us this morning, afternoon for you, to be here and discuss about what happened with the pandemic and what is the consequence for a city like Montreal. And thank you for Sciences Po Paris for this invitation, and my co-speaker, very happy to be here with you this morning. For Montreal, you see, we have a lot of problem. There's a lot of objective that we have to resolve, and of course, there's a lot of problem that happens that we're like Mayor Kennan says, that we're not prepared to face up. And so, what I like to speak this morning, of course, is some topics just to explain exactly what happened here and what is the challenge for a city like Montreal. During the past year, Montreal was the epicenter of the Canada and Quebec of the pandemic. So there's the place where we have most people who got the COVID-19. So for us, it's very difficult things to manage, especially that we don't have all the leverage to control the pandemic and all the leverage to control the difficulties whose occur by this pandemic. For example, there's a lot of challenge highlight and aggravate the existing inequalities for their vulnerabilities and with all the communities in Montreal. As many cities, the crisis disproportionately affect some part of the population, especially for the vulnerable groups and the homeless, of course, in Montreal. For example, we have to accommodate 750 homeless people in emergency shelter in Montreal. So it's very hard to work and found some place for that kind of people who have most people who can be affected mostly by the pandemic. So we work to find temporary sites, sanitary facilities, and of course work with some of these population who don't have all the access and can understand exactly what is the special problem. For example, 4 hotels in Montreal were adapted in order to accommodate that homeless people. So it's important for us to have that collaboration of the hotel manager to help the city to help the homeless in Montreal. Of course, we have some problem too with some discrimination towards certain group of the population, particularly the Asian communities in Montreal. We had a great Asian communities in Montreal. So we have some, problem with the problem of the systematic racism. And so there's a debate in the city during the pandemic about what we can do about this. So in the summer, recommendation following the citywide public consultation on discrimination and racism in Montreal was also made public. So in response, the city just act in a 3-way to immediately recognize the systemic nature of the racism and discrimination, and designated an elected official responsible for the fighting against racism and discrimination. Is the first time in Montreal that we have a person who just worked rightly on that. An elected official was named on the executive committee to ensure that all the recommendations be followed, and a new dedicated office was created to address that issue. So it's helped very much right now with the Asian community, especially to face that racism problem that with the pandemic accelerated badly right now. the social issue were accompanied the human planning too, as we can see. The mayor kind of said about the digital divide. So we can see here too, because the vulnerable people just be affected mostly by that situation. And so we have to plan the city and some act about what we can plan in the future to be sure to be more resilient for that population. We need more services and more help by the city of Montreal. In the early months of the pandemic, the city proactively organized some order to cooperate, coordinate, and share the experience with all the people, and especially with the emergency of the pandemic. Of course, we couldn't travel or hold public events, but we work with the other cities in the world to just share the best practices to help the city to more actively act on the field for the vulnerable group, and especially on the public space. Management of the public space is very a huge issue for us, and of course the public transportation. We have to know exactly how to manage for the people who don't have access to other kind of transportation in the city, who have to go to work on the place of their work if they cannot work at home. So there's a lot of management of some vulnerable people to manage for the public plan for that. Of course, with the other plan, at the international level, all the initiative came from the C40 Recovery Task Force, which the mayor of Montreal just help us to improve our public health, reduce inequality, and address the climate crisis too. And it's important to focus on that point too, because the pandemic that we occur right now and have to manage came from that crisis, and just make some point of how we can be more resilient in the future for a city as Montreal. So the question must be asked ourselves, say, how do we want to redesign and reinvent the city after COVID? What we can do in the future to be more prepared, and what is necessary to face that kind of crisis? So because we, as we know, it's probably not the last one that we have to work on it. So we need to lay the foundation for a resilient, prosperous, green, and inclusive cities. For us, it's very important to help the citizen in that three guideline for Montreal and for our administration. We have to, like I said, reinvent the city, building our four pillars, especially solidarity, equity, and inclusion. For us, it's very important. Urban planning and mobility, it's the second pillars. Accelerate and the ecologic transition, it's the third one. And stimulate innovation and creativity, because the downtown of Montreal is very affected right now. The economy is affected, but people, workers are affected. So we have to be more innovative and creative to face the future, even who can be affect Montreal. So we have to reinvent Montreal. We are on the good way right now, but we have a lot of obstacles who's coming in the future.
Thank you very much. That was great. Okay, and Professor Kilgren-Grandi, you're up next.
Thank you, Nilda. It is a pleasure to be here and share the screen with Mayor Cannon and Mayor Coteau and yourself. Well, I would like to try and frame the very interesting contribution of our two mayors in the broader framework of city diplomacy. We can see the main elements arising from the words, this result-driven impact, this idea of cooperation, collaboration between cities that has existed over the last decade, but became even more visible and tangible during COVID-19. This crisis that created problems unforeseen. Many cities were working on their resiliency, but truth be said, all of them were harshly hit by that, and they had to reinvent and show the creativity that the two mayors have been talking about. we have seen this collaboration taking more or less three different levels. The first one, alongside the value of solidarity, which is an old value of city diplomacy, with help, sometimes material help, sometimes masks, equipment, medical equipment from one city to the other. And the new thing here is actually that this help didn't follow the traditional high-income cities, low-income cities that is traditional in the development cooperation, but it was more rather in cities that are less affected by the pandemic to cities that are more affected. And that's why, for example, cities like French cities, Italian cities, they received help from their counterparts in China, in Germany and other countries across the world. So this somehow reshuffled an element of solidarity that was already present. Then the knowledge exchange. Mayor Coteau mentioned C40. C40, together with many other city networks like IMF, the International Association of Francophone Mayors, they created platforms to share best practices, to show what cities are doing and try to teach others and learn from others. Today, there are more than 60 of those platforms where cities can find interesting ideas to adapt for the local context. And finally, this idea of imagining together, creating together the future that awaits us. A future that, as Mayor Coteau said, is a future that has to be sustainable, equal, resilient, taking into consideration the inequalities and the weaknesses that have been highlighted by the pandemic. Well, if we compare this system with the international systems, we see that there are limits still affecting this international cooperation of cities. We often talk about cities wanting a place at the global table, meaning they can be part of international negotiation to reimagine the future, to imagine the sustainable future for all. And this has some limit, which is sort of a heritage of an old system where only states were actually allowed to be present and active internationally, but still limits in terms of international law and national law what a city can and cannot do. How to resolve that? Well, there are many examples of fora. One is actually hosted by the city of Geneva, the Geneva Cities Hub, that works on defining new strategies. And this is something that is important to do, especially in cooperation with cities across the world and experts. And my take would be to highlight the idea of complementarity. From my experience when I first started working in city diplomacy at the municipality of Milan, I figured out that it was extremely important not to present city diplomacy as an alternative, but rather an approach that complements national diplomacy, complements the goals expressed by intergovernmental organizations, by the United Nations, European Union, and so on. It is important to show and do somehow a pedagogical approach, to have a pedagogical approach towards public opinion, towards national leaders, to show what can be exactly the added value of cities in those difficult times. And finally, just a word on how we can support this as a university. I think it is absolutely important that the universities are part of this sort of global effort for a more sustainable world, matching international organizations, cities, and nation states with all the civil society organizations and the private sector. I think it's important that there is a support in assessing the impact of city diplomacy, cooperating with cities in defining local strategies, as well as training a new generation of city diplomats, just like Sciences Po and Columbia are doing right now.
Super, thank you very much. It was a nice framing. Okay, so now we'll turn to our next segment, which is where we get to ask each other questions and talk amongst each other. So let me start with Mayor Canaan. What questions do you have for the rest of the panel today?
Yes, thank you, Professor Mesa. Actually, I see that we're already converging on several issues, and this is a positive opportunity to learn from each other how to progress. My first question goes to Lorenzo Kilgangrandi. He has a lot of experience of interaction as, I mean, he's himself in a platform. You're very specialized in interactions internationally between local entities or specific entities, as you said, apart from the classical national diplomatic or international organization schemes. Again, how would you see the opportunity created by this crisis? I mean, the crisis is obviously very negative and source of damage, but still as an opportunity to increase the role of this, and how your experience to make it as effective as possible.
Thank you very much, Mayor Cannon, for this very interesting and complex question. Well, I think that cities have expressed a series of values that are basically leading their action, both locally and internationally. They're known for being able to create this connection between what happens locally and what connects to the global stage. Previously, before the pandemic, many of those issues were extremely difficult to implement on a broader term, because even if they were somehow supported by different cities and local actors, they had quite an important political cost at national level. I'm thinking about, for example, the global transition toward a green economy that, of course, as you know, has some obstacle of political terms. Same thing for investing in fighting inequalities, as well as to this approach of transnational solidarity that later has been attacked as a sort of wasting money and basically forgetting the needs and difficulties of the population. I think that the pandemic has had a very strong impact on the way those topics are actually perceived right now by the general population. And I look forward to see how this new relationship that link people to nature. We have been somehow confined, we have been under lockdown, separated from the opportunity of enjoying life and enjoying the nature. Same thing, we have seen how this pandemic has caused longer queues of people asking for a meal. Those activities, those experiences, they somehow make a progressive agenda that has been rising in many cities and make somehow vehiculated by many city networks more, I would say, politically appropriate right now. It's probably easier to reconnect this agenda to national agenda. So I would try and have somehow a fresh start and say, okay, things are changed. We now see what is happening. We believe we can build something new with this multi-level approach. So take into consideration that cities are complementing what nation states want to do, and they, as such, it is important that they are part of the creation of a general strategy. And the same thing for international organization and both at regional and global level.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if I may just comment, so one thing that comes up pretty regularly is what are the city's own powers? And this comes up, vis-a-vis the national government or any international agreements or organizations and so forth. And I want to note that in the United States, it's a different set of arrangements, if you will. The US Constitution provides for, so typically power is devolved from the Constitution to the national government. In the US, the Constitution has the power from the people to the national government, but also to the states. And from this, and while cities are not mentioned in the US Constitution, the power is devolved from the states. So it's independent of the national government. As a result, each of the states has a different sort of bundle of rights and responsibilities that cities have, but it's a separate authority, which means that I think in the US, quite often cities can feel more empowered than in other countries where perhaps the powers are derived solely from the national government. And I think this is an important dynamic to see as you're looking at, amongst relations amongst different cities. So anyway, I just wanted to make that comment because I think that it's relevant to what it is that you as mayors can do, as well as mayors in other cities and other countries. All right, so so now, if I may, Mayor Croteau, what is your question that you would like to pose for our other panelists today?
I have a question too for Dr. Reddy, especially because right now in Montreal we work a lot with universities, research center to help us to transform the city and make more great decision for the future and be more resilient. And so my question is, what is exactly you think the role of the university in research for the development of the city of post-COVID world? So do you think it can be more important, or what is the role the university can do in that post-COVID world?
Thank you very much, Mayor Croteau, for this question. Also very complex. Well, I will try to give my answer. Universities, they have this capacity to, first of all, assess and issue a diagnostic of the situation. This is definitely of paramount important for building something new, is to know exactly what is happening right now. And there are different fields that can cooperate within a university to paint this big picture of the city of today, including all the weaknesses of the city. So it is absolutely important to involve sociologists, to involve political scientists, to involve urbanists, of course, in this sort of joint description, joint analysis of what is the city right now. And after that, the experts, they can definitely connect this sort of painting to another painting that is the one that the population and the local leaders, they want to have at their future. So the university can provide specific tools, methodologies, ideas, best practices in order to sort of enhance and boost this transition. I think I mentioned earlier, I think it's also important that universities, they cooperate in terms of training, not only education, which is their primary goal, but also training of public officials, because sometimes there are these new challenges that arises, and universities can provide a sort of fresh, I would say, vision, an update of the competences, and this would somehow boost the capacity of the municipality to react and to implement its own objectives.
Great. Very interesting question. I know that there are opportunities also for students to get involved oftentimes in developing answers to these sorts of questions. And one of the advantages with universities is that, it can be like a laboratory. It can be a place where, different ideas can be tried out. And it's not, sort of, the stakes aren't quite so high. There's not so much budget attached. And then, yes, as Lorenzo pointed out, you have this potentially fresh view from, a bit of the outside that can generate some new ideas. Okay, now, Lorenzo, Professor Kilgren-Grandi, at last, it's your turn to ask questions of our panelists. You're muted.
Thank you very much. That always happens. Thank you very much, Professor Mesa. I have a question for both our mayors, which is linked to one of the main obstacles to city diplomacy up until now that refrain some cities to even act internationally. So how do you communicate international solidarity? That is very difficult for cities because just like nation states, there is this rising sentiment of populism, of placing, in that case, the city first, my country first, and then it's the city first. And I've seen that this sort of criticism have been risen by both sides of the spectrum, regardless of the political stance of the mayor and the council. So this is somehow an omnipresent criticism, and I would like to ask you, how could you respond to this sort of need to defend transnational solidarity?
If you don't mind, I'm going to start. Thank you for this excellent question. Of course, it's I think it's quite different from different continent, because how it works in North America, especially in Quebec, for a city as Montreal, and for example, Geneva, it's very different because of the constitution of our countries. So for us, what I can say about what we're working, we have some platform where we can just communicate and have some relation with other city and just be sure that we can share best practices. For example, l'Association des maires francophones, who was a great place to work with other city like Montreal and with other francophone mayors. We have this opportunity to share and always communicate with the other city to be sure that we can react correctly with all the problem that the pandemic caused to us, and for the future too, how we can be more prepared for that kind of crisis. And I think we have to be more present in that kind of forum to be sure that the sharing of the best practices and the communication with other cities can be more active. I think the urban diplomacy, it's going to be more important than ever with that crisis. And for us, I think it's a priority for Montreal to be at every place. On the other way, we have C40. We have to be more present on that instance too, because it's an important challenge for all the world and all the cities to be more creative to share and to reach the goal of the climate crisis that give the humanity the greatest challenge that we never occurred before. But in the context of North America, the city has different problems. For example, as Nilda says, for the constitution of the country, in Montreal is not quite different than New York City. For example, all the healthcare in Canada is the responsibility of the province. It's like the state. So and at the other point, all the problem with the homeless and the healthcare on the city, if we don't have the help of the province and the help financially for the homeless, we cannot do the right thing in Montreal. And on the other point, if we don't have we cannot just apply on some program who was made by the Canada, because we have to pass through the province. So it's an obstacle for us. So that's why we can work more with other cities to find the best practices in that kind of situation too, to find the way that Montreals can act properly and more effectively on the field, and so to see with the different governments, so the Quebec and the Canada, how they can give more power to the city and take example of what can be or do in the other city to give the example of why we can and why we want more power to act for our population. So I think the urban diplomacy is going to be very important in the next month and the next years to be sure that city can be more prepared and more effective on the field to help our citizens.
Yes, thank you too. I mean, obviously I'm close to what François Coteau just said in general. We have in common that even with all variation of the national constitution in all our states, except very few exceptions, the cities have no real established role in terms of part of the power decision-making system in a way, the same in Switzerland. We finally have been mentioned in the last revision of the constitution, of the Swiss federal constitution, but it's really at the margin of the constitution. We are mentioned somewhere, but obviously far, far away from the position of the cantons, which are like the provinces and the states. On the other hand, it's true that the situation evolved, that the National Union of Cities in Switzerland is now being involved in many discussions, in many consultation, not enough in the pandemic, as I said before, but more globally for public policy making. But we still have trouble within the parliament, and it's a matter of division of power, because actually the federal state would be in favor of giving us more space, but the cantons, the traditional cantons, are afraid of losing power in a way. And I guess it's in many countries the same. And cities are places of, social questioning, political questioning, and national state don't like that either. I mean, the upper levels don't like that. So it's indeed a challenge, because on one hand, nobody really rejects the fact that we are a reality as cities. We know what's happening. I mean, most of the people live in cities. We're really dealing with concrete issues. So it's like, I mean, if we go frontal, it doesn't work for the moment. I mean, like asking for like a place at the table in a more formal way, I'm not sure it's useful in a short-term perspective. Since I'm mayor of Geneva, we have obviously a lot of experience with international organizations in Geneva, the whole UN ecosystem, which is very diverse. So 30 years ago, the NGOs had to find a place at the table. Now it sounds like obvious. Academics, private companies around the international organizations. But the cities is still very at the beginning of the story, because the states are a bit skeptical. The international organizations, they are very willing to include cities, local governments, and their networks. Like it was mentioned, IMF, but also UCLG, I mean, the main one, and C40 and all of them, because they need the expertise. They need a more pragmatic approach to issues. I mean, obviously, because it's less formal, it's less blocked by national divergence and conflicts. But as soon as it gets out of the expertise role, then it becomes complicated to have really cities at the table. We are mostly, I mean, the networks are classified under NGOs, the network of cities, which is very like wide and defined status. It's not useful enough. So there is a tension at the moment. And that's why City of Geneva created, with the support of the Canton of Geneva and the federal states, the Geneva Cities Hub, to work on this, to improve the interface between international Geneva in the widest sense. I mean, agencies, NGOs, state, I mean, national diplomatic missions, and cities and their networks. And at the moment, we mainly work on concrete issues like health, like public transport, like diversity, migration. And I guess step by step, everybody will recognize that there is some way to find how to put cities at the table. But the other issue, and François Coteau mentioned it, is our own constituency. I mean, our electors don't like us traveling in a way, if I put it like this, because they expect from us mainly to work for local level. So we have to prove, and it's not easy, but it's possible, how the international work serves also local interests. That's very important. I mean, if you only have like, prestigious meetings, that's where the word diplomacy is a bit ambiguous. We don't like to use it in the City of Geneva, because diplomacy is associated with like, high level prestigious, whatever summits. We have to prove that it has, as François Coteau said, exchange of good practices, exchange of ideas, maybe also resources like City of Geneva supporting African cities, for example. I mean, it has to show that, especially in Geneva, it's like Montreal, we have a very diverse population, very multicultural. So it relates also to relation to the original countries of part of our own population. So that's indeed very important. And I think we are maybe better equipped as cities to go into concrete issues which raise populism. You know, I mean, people feeling marginalized economically, socially, culturally. We manage diversity much better, let's say, cities, like maybe much better than states and provinces and so on. So we need this exchange of practice and we need spaces to act. One of the positive sides of the pandemic, it has made, like today, virtual exchange possible. I mean, we have all trained in it. We obviously all prefer physical meetings because we lose a lot of informal part but still it makes it a bit more effective and pragmatic and accessible also to have in between also virtual exchanges about very practical issues. So I think we have a role to play and to exchange on it with all the colleagues. As a last example before I stop talking, recently at the board of the IMF, so the French-speaking cities network, I raised the issue within diversity that also the IMF should tackle the issue of LGBT discrimination, you know, about sexual and gender orientation and so on, which is a difficult issue because our African and Maghreb colleagues. But they said, yes, that's true. Somehow we have to tackle it. So cities have a more pragmatic approach because it's the same question within a state meeting. National states would be much more complicated.
This is all consistent as well in the US. So a very similar dynamics.
Professor Mesa, I remember the US cities rebelling against President Trump at the beginning. Exactly. About the climate issue, for example, or the migration issue. It was fantastic in a way.
Right, exactly. And so, and this, you know, again, you know, touching back to what I said before about the powers deriving from the states and the Constitution rather than from the federal government gives a certain amount of, you know, I guess freedom or legitimacy or whatever. Plus, you know, by and large, Americans can be somewhat rebellious anyway. So, but it's interesting because when I was with the city of New York, one of the most effective things that we did was join a number of these networks. So, and this is within the context of resiliency and sustainability and so forth, but still. So there is an organization in the US called the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. I believe that there are members on it also from Canada at this point. But anyway, one of the things that we were able to do on just the sort of city to city level was just exchange best practices and do some, you know, various committees or task forces or whatever were formed where we could just undertake some questions that were pressing and in common with a number of other cities. And the other thing that happens, so it's a very effective organization, and it's one that doesn't require a lot of travel, which is also an issue for cities in the US, and residents aren't too keen on mayors, you know, jetting off to exotic places that don't have much to do with, you know, what's going on in the city. But so one of the things that happened as well within this network, and I've seen it as well with C40 and ICLEI and UCLG and, you know, other similar city networks that are also very effective, is that there's this friendly competition that happens, you know, to some degree amongst cities where, you know, you may, and it doesn't matter what the size of the cities are. So it could be that, you know, the smaller or the medium-sized cities are able to be, because they have less bureaucracy, are able sometimes to be more innovative because they can afford to take certain risks. And sometimes they just have to, they don't have any choice. And then large cities will learn from the smaller and medium-sized cities, and then they can go to their own, you know, governments and say, you know, city council or whoever, and say, look, it worked over there in that city, it worked. So see, it's not so risky. And then in addition, cities like to be able to sort of brag about, how innovative they are and how effective they are. And so this type of interchange, that I've seen on the sustainability front really helped raise the bar and really helped raise the standards amongst cities, as well as spurred some technological innovation and some market innovation as well, because there were cities that were able to kind of come together and say, okay, we're going to write a generic like request for proposal for something like, say, electric buses, and therefore, because we have so much market share, because we purchase so many things, then that can help spur innovation as well. So it's interesting to see how many parallels there are. Okay, so we're at the point where we can start taking questions from our viewers. So let me turn to that. And again, if you have any questions that you would like to pose, please post them in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll be able to get to them. All right, so let's see what we've got here. Okay, considering, so this is from Alana Tang, who is from New York, and she's in the dual BA undergrad, Columbia and Sciences Po. And she asks, considering high urban densities, what are the panelists' thoughts on using vaccine passports within cities to restart life?
I'll let my colleague Sami answer if you want.
Yes, thank you also. It's a very, sincerely, a very difficult question, but it's a very important question which needs answer, because we have discussion in probably all countries affected by the pandemic. And it's very tempting, but it raises a lot of ethical and other issues about inclusion. I mean, what happens to the people who do not have so-called vaccine passports? Actually, I would like to avoid the word passport, because passport is a very specific word for a travel document, an official ID in a way from the country, allowing you to travel elsewhere. I mean, vaccine certificates have been existing beforehand. Typically, if you travel to some countries with tropical diseases, you need some vaccination beforehand, obligatory, yellow fever, whatever, these kind of things. So it's not absurd as such. I think we will have to move forward. We have a discussion in Switzerland, for example, to access to cultural events, to sports events, major sports events. And many people are asking for it, but wouldn't be happy if they were excluded. Now, the vaccination strategy is finally moving forward in Switzerland. It has been very slow, but a lot of people still, for personal reasons, ethical reasons, don't want to be vaccinated. So I think we will have it, but it has to be as open as possible and not lead to exclusion of people who, for health reasons, for example, cannot be vaccinated, because we would have a two-speed society. And even if people say, okay, but it's only for non-vital activities, like, as I said, culture and sport, but culture and sport are vital activities in a social context within a city. So I'm not very enthusiastic about the idea. And if we implement vaccine passport, it would be with very clear rules about avoiding exclusion.
If I can go in the same way, it's not a here right now in Quebec a point that it's considered to be made and to implement. The difficulties is because the variability of the pandemic between different region of the province, it's very high, and so it's difficult to implement that kind of passport, because there's no boundary or very strong, or there's example to pass from a city from another one. You don't have some control of people who can go by anyways. So, and I think we have a question of legal problem too to implement that kind of certificate or a passport, because all the countries have different charter or different legal constitutions. So from some place you can do it because of the constitution. But here, for example, the Charter of Rights and Freedom of Canada can't authorize that kind of passport here, because there's going to be a contest in courts, and of course the people who want to implement that will lose in court. So I think right now all the province manage that situation differently because they have all the power, and cities are just not included in that that planification. The other point is, of course, Montreal here, it's the most populated city in Quebec. For most, the region of Montreal is 50% of all the population of the province. And the other peoples not living in the metropolitan area have negative perception of the metropolitan. And if they want to include a vaccine passport, nobody will allow Montrealers to go to their city, and there will be some, discrimination of some people who came from cities. That actually it's happened. Some place who have no big problem with the pandemic, who can let their restaurant open. If you came in the restaurant, they ask for ID, and if you're coming from Montreal, you cannot have access to that place. So imagine if you implement a vaccine passport, it can have a lot of social problem. So I think actually it's not for us a good solution.
Okay, thank you. All right. Oh, Lorenzo, did you want to say something?
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I would like to just add, based on the answers of our two mayors, that this is probably something that will find a concrete decision at national level, or in the case of Europe, at the European level. They are already working, many states, the European Commission, they're working to define this aspect. But I think this is a clear example where the multi-level governance would be extremely important. For the reasons that have been raised by Mr. Grotto and Mr. Cannon, it's extremely important to have a clear vision on both the pro and cons of this kind of decision in the concrete terms. And the role of the mayor here is important because he is the closest political elected figure to the population. And at the same time, the cities are the #1 provider of public services across the world. So these two elements make it very important their voice in the definition of this complex task.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so let me move on to another question. So this is from Max Boucher, who's affiliated with Brookings Institution and an alum of Sciences Po. Can the mayors talk about the local, this is building on what we were just talking about, can the mayors talk about the local national partnership, especially in the context of cities advocating for a bigger share of COVID recovery funding? What sort of actions and influence can mayors deploy collectively to communicate their needs?
It's a good question. Actually, for Montreal, the way that we communicate and ask for our needed, it's just to discuss with the province, because for, like I said, the health care, it's responsible from the Quebec province, and excluded the urban plan and transportation and some services like this. All the plans for the economy of Montreal, it has to come from the province of Quebec. So right now, we mostly practice negotiation in private to be sure that we can have some resources from the Quebec province. It's not the time to fight on public space between different stage of power. And we have some communication for the citizen to be sure that we're allied in that pandemics. So for us, it's very important to be sure that citizen cannot see some divergence or some problem between the city and the province, and we have the same kind of line or communication to ensure that we manage correctly the crisis. So it can be different from other places, but right now that's the strategy that we put it in, and it's working right now.
Yes, to complement François Coteau's answer, as far as possible, we try to avoid, just being on conflict with upper levels, because it's useless and doesn't bring things forward. We may be in a situation of challenging the upper levels, trying to do it in a constructive way with proposals, with some lobbying. A typical example, and there's another question about that, is public transport. It is a fact that the pandemic reduced the traffic in a classical sense, especially car traffic. And it has created the opportunity to increase really cycle paths and other alternative way of transport, which are now maintained beyond the crisis. And often in these situations, the cities are the ones who are proposing new ways to do. And sometimes the first reaction is negative of the upper level. And then suddenly they start negotiating because they see it corresponds to to popular will, if we can prove it. So it's a kind of balance between challenging the upper level, sometimes also, being not agreeing with it, but within a democratic debate, which is normal and acceptable, and working together, because at the end, the population doesn't want to have us fighting all the time. It's not productive. So it's a right balance to find. And we are all learning in this, being at local level in Geneva or at national level in Switzerland, or even at international level, by the way.
Makes sense. Okay, I'm going to have another question from Myrtia Guéin from Avignon, and she's an undergrad with Sciences Po. And her question is, during the pandemic, some French mayors decided to illegally adapt their local policy to the situation. For example, reopen museums. Sometimes it failed and they were recalled by the state. Sometimes it contributed to changing national politics. Do you think it can be good leverage to make the cities act more independently from state obstacles?
I read a lot of things of what happened in France, especially with some mayors just decided to do some pressure or act illegally to open some places. It's interesting for us because for the, to think about what exactly we have to done or do in Montreal, the point is, and as I say before, the point is to be sure that we're just working together with the province and to be sure that the population can see that we control the situation. I think it's more constructive to work with the province and to be sure that we discuss of the problem of the city in private, not publicly, and act correctly for the citizen of Montreal. And so we decided here to follow the directive of the province because we just discussed before there was implement, and we agreed with that. In some points, sometimes we're not totally agreed. We said it publicly, but we decided not to front the government of Quebec to be sure that after that the relation is still good between us, and we can have a leverage to have what we ask it for. So it's some kind of strategy that some mayor can have, but it depends of the political context too. In France, you have very party who can be join with national party in Montreal. We don't have that kind of situation. For example, the administration party is not linked with a national party, so we don't have a national strategy to make some politics with that. So that's why it can help us to be sure that we're independent about what the governments vote. So I think it can be different, and I know that in Geneva it's very different too, because the governance is very more complex than here, and there's a lot of different and have a different context of a political context too.
Yeah, briefly, I mean, I fully agree with Francois Croteau that just disobeying to a national decision is, I mean, a democratic country is not to be recommended, because you put population in a very difficult situation where they would have to choose in a way between who is right, you know, is it the national authority or the local authority? And this should be avoided as far as possible. We can express the fact that we disagree. We can make counter proposals. At least in Switzerland, I don't have any examples where cities or any local entities have taken decisions contrary to the national or cantonal decisions. Because at the end, I mean, the population, it's already tough enough, this pandemic. So if in addition, the authorities start to be in conflict, it makes things much worse at the end. But we indeed, one of my main fields of responsibility is culture. So we many times expressed our disagreement that the restrictions were so strong for cultural events, and make proposals, you know, how to manage a safe way to do cultural events. It starts to work. In other fields, I won't make the whole list, but it's a matter of negotiations and public expression. Yes, yes, but without disobeying. I'm not convinced of that strategy.
Okay. All right, I'm going to do the next question to Lorenzo. Given the institutional difference, this is from Zhejiang Zhang, and pardon me if I've mispronounced your name, who's an MPhil in history at Oxford. Given the institutional differences between cities when placed in an international arena, how would you envision the dynamic between participating cities? What would be the place of cities outside of Western liberal democracies? And what could be the place of cities within liberal democracies?
Thank you. This is a very interesting question, quite complex. It talks about the freedom of independent political action of cities in different countries in the world. What cities do, it is quite similar. Of course, the powers can change a little bit from one constitutional order and to the other. But basically, we have this symbol of the city being the closest institutional political element and number one provider of public services. What definitely changes is the capacity of councils, municipal councils, to have their own priorities and follow them in even if this is not on the line of the national government. And we have seen a lot of examples in the framework of environmental law, environmental regulations. We have seen the protests, we were mentioning that before, in the US under the Trump presidency, with initiative at national level of mayors trying to make sure the agreement was respected. Even though the federal government wasn't being part of it. Same thing for migrants, with different approaches to diversity, migration, and the status of migrants. I believe that despite some countries across the world do not have the capacity to design their own international strategy in a way which is independent to the national stage. We're talking about many countries, a big share of countries in the world do not allow a full political independence of cities in their international action. Nevertheless, I would definitely advocate for these exchanges to take place, especially given the topic that we have been discussing of this pragmatic problem-solving approach. I would definitely advise cities in a democratic country to exchange with cities in non-democratic countries, not only to improve the quality of population on both sides through this exchange, but also to foster this circulation of ideas of openness that might eventually lead to a positive political change in the country, which is currently not democratic.
Mr. Mayor Coto or Mayor Kanan, would you like to add anything to that? You're good. Okay.
The answer was very complete from Lorenzo.
All right. So we have time for one more question. So let me pose this to you. So this is from Nurul Isnaini. And again, apologies if I have not pronounced your name correctly, from the IR department with Universitas Indonesia. Do you think informal multilateralism enhanced by transnational municipalities networks such as C40 has threatened the existing global governance led by state actors, leading to a new global order? And to what extent do you think this kind of network has brought any advantage to empower cities as effective international actors who then can potentially contribute to global peace and national advancement?
Is Sammy go first or me? I depend.
You can start, Francois.
Good question. I think the informal multilateralism between municipality right now don't threaten exactly the what actually happened between states. I think it's complement exactly what happened. It's important to see that as a parallel process with cities working together actively in some multilateral platform or network. But that discussion and that collaboration help state when they have that their reunion or conference to discuss together how they can work together. So I think it's not a threat, but an opportunity to help a better collaboration between state and just go forward fastly and better for our constituent and for our citizen, and can help all the states to be more effective in the fight against some kind of crisis that we just experiment right now. So I think it's an opportunity, not a threat.
Yes, to complement this answer, we have to avoid being naive. Obviously, in some countries, non-liberal countries, I mean, autocratic regimes, the cities have no major margin to express any specific views, even, I mean, locally and then internationally. The space of discussion between cities is easier than between states, as I said before. I mean, there is some space for free discussions, but sooner or later, typically, if the cities want a seat at the table of international norm-setting processes, which is not only about expertise or bringing good practice into the international discussion, but also taking part in an international negotiation. I give an example happening in Geneva, in the UN system at the moment. What are the international norms about digital control of public space? I mean, what do you do with recording of people walking around in public spaces? I mean, how far does the private sphere and the private life still exist in the public space or not, and so on, with tracing? And we know that technology is evolving very fast. And in these type of events, cities coming from countries which have no really democratic regime will have trouble to express other views than the national government. But still, it is a bit more open and pragmatic. And I think this is a tool within the multi-stakeholder approach where we need it to solve international issues. I think cities and their networks, and C40, Geneva is not member, we looked how to get member, but C40 has been very effective to bring the voice of cities at international level in the Conference of Parties in Paris and other the following ones. And international organizations, now we feel that they start to really count on cities and the networks to counterbalance situations where the states are rather blocking things. So it's a complex game. It's not easy because cities have first to coordinate their own positions themselves between, but it's worthwhile to work on this.
Lorenzo, did you have anything to add?
Absolutely. I think I totally agree with Mr. Coteau and Mr. Cannon. I might want to add that the threat, it is not on the governance, but it is a political threat. That is true. Definitely mayors, especially when they act in coalition, they can do this awareness raising and advocacy activity that somehow can even target national states. And this has happened at several times. It's likely to happen even more in the future. In terms of cooperation, I totally agree with the analysis of the mayors. I believe that the number one connection are, in fact, international organizations, which are intergovernmental at the origin, but as Mayor Cannon was saying, are more and more interesting in applying this multi-level partnership, which is even actually one of the Sustainable Development Goals is Sustainable Development Goals number 17, which advocate for partnership for sustainable development.
Thank you. And we are actually a couple of minutes over time. So I want to thank the members of our audience, our viewers, for coming to this and for your very thoughtful questions. And particularly big thank you to our panelists today. It was a very interesting discussion. So really appreciate your time and your candor and forthrightness and your analysis. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.